Hello, and welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Today we'll be discussing a few signings, including a big extension in Vancouver, as well as a couple of RFA signings with the Montreal Canadiens and the Dallas Stars. We have a trade to discuss, and on top of that, I have two rumors about the Vancouver Canucks and the Detroit Red Wings, and we'll get to all of that coming up right now. Hello again, and welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. I want to start off with a couple of signings. First, I want to get to the Dallas Stars. Now, the Dallas Stars went into this offseason needing two huge signings. One for their star winger, Jason Robertson, and another for their star goaltender, Jake Oettinger. Well, they got one of them done over the past week as they signed Jake Oettinger to a 3-year, $4 million contract. Now, Oettinger had a really good breakout year last year, putting up a good 2.52 goals against average and a .914 save percentage in 48 games. He did start the year in the minors, but after the team went through a few injuries, he got the call up and he ran away with the starting job in Dallas. But the place he really shined was in the first round of last year's playoffs when the Dallas Stars were playing the Calgary Flames, where he put up an astounding 1.81 goals against average and a .954 save percentage in the 7-game series against the Calgary Flames. And probably one of the top 15 goalies in the NHL right now. So signing him to a 3-year, $4 million deal, a great job, nice bridge deal. So he'll be an RFA at the end of the contract. Dallas will be able to try to re-sign him again in 3 years' time. But for now, this is an amazing extension. You don't usually see goalies getting 2 long-term deals. So 3 years by $4 million is a really good deal for Dallas. This only leaves them with about $7 million in cap space to sign RFA Jason Robertson. And they may need to use all of their cap space to sign him because Robertson is a good player coming off a 40-goal season. But good signing for the Stars with Oettinger. I do think this is a really good value signing. And I think off of this career year, Oettinger is just going to continue to grow and become an elite goalie and a great number 1 starter for the Dallas Stars. Next, we have the Montreal Canadiens, who signed Kirby Dach today. They signed Dach to a 4-year contract extension at $3.36 million per year. Now, Dach was acquired at the draft by the Montreal Canadiens. They moved the Islanders' first-round pick, which they got for Alexander Romanov, for Dach. Dach is a former 3rd overall pick, but he hasn't really lived up to expectations in Chicago, as he only put up 9 goals and 26 points in 70 games last year. But I do think he could have a breakout year in Montreal, because the Canadiens do have a lot of good offensive weapons, and if they can stay healthy this year, I could see Dach doing a lot better than he did in Chicago. Now, as we have talked about before, the Canadiens do have a lot of center depth with Dvorak, Suzuki, Dach, Monahan, even Jake Evans. They have a lot of center depths. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Canadiens move Dach to the wing or one of those centers. Either probably Dach or Monahan will go to the wing. But I definitely do see that Dach having a chance to maybe push 50 to 60 points this year and really prove himself that it'd be a good second-line center or top 6 forward, depending on if he plays the center or the wing. I do think this is good value. He will be an RFA at the end of the deal, so the Canadiens will not lose him for nothing, but they will be able to negotiate a long-term extension in 4 years' time. But I do think this was a great trade for the Canadiens to pick up Dach, and I think this is a really good signing, and I think Dach will excel with the Montreal Canadiens. And lastly, I want to get to the big news. The Vancouver Canucks were able to extend J.T. Miller. Now, I was one of the people who thought that J.T. Miller would have been traded. I thought he would have been more valuable to the Canucks as a trade chip rather than signing him, as he is 30 years old and entering the latter half of his career. But this is a monster signing. He signs a 7-year, $8 million deal to remain with the Canucks. Now, this is probably influenced from the Nazem Kadri deal, who got a 7-year, $7 million contract with Calgary, and he's only a year older than Miller. So these are pretty similar contracts, and I think Kadri's signing definitely had impacts on the Miller signing, but because Miller can play wing, and he put up a lot more points in his career year last year than Kadri did in his career year, I do think that's what justified the $1 million more per year than Kadri's. But I do think that this really handicaps them a bit with their cap situation, as they will have $8 million on the cap hit, not starting this year. This year they still have the $5.25 million on Miller's cap hit, but starting next year, for the next 7 years, they'll have at an $8 million cap hit, which will be the highest paid forward in the forward group as of right now. But This is a good signing. I do think Miller can live up to an $8 million cap hit for the next 3 to 4 years. He definitely showed last year how much of a point producer he can be by putting up 32 goals and 99 points in 80 games. And I do think that he can probably put between the 80 to 90 mark for the next at least 2 years and 70 to 80 mark within the next 3 to 4 years. I do think he'll probably start to tail off towards the end of that contract, and it will really handicap the Canucks when they have an $8 million J.T. Miller at age like 35 who's not producing 60, 70 points anymore. But I do think for the foreseeable future, with the Canucks in win-now mode, this is a really good deal. And while I do think this contract will not age well for the Vancouver Canucks for short term, for the next 2 to 3 years, maybe 3 to 4, this is going to be a great signing for the Vancouver Canucks. So next I want to go on to a trade that happened recently, and that is that the Anaheim Ducks acquired veteran defenseman Dmitry Kulikov from the Minnesota Wild for future considerations, which is usually nothing. Now, for the Wild's perspective, this is really just a cap dump. They have very little cap right now due to the buyout penalty of Parise and Suter that they had from buying them out last year. And that cap penalty is really handicapping the Wild and what they can do. So they just needed to get rid of a defenseman. They didn't take anything back because basically they just cleared $2.25 million in cap off their books for this year. And they now have about $5 million in cap. So it's a pretty good deal for the Wild. This also allows some younger guys, maybe like Kalen Addison, to get a shot at making the Wild's roster this year. I do think that Addison is probably the most likely to get an NHL roster spot this year of their good young D-core. And I think that if he can prove enough this year, maybe he takes a top 4 role next year if they do lose Dumba via free agency. But it's definitely a good trade for the Wild to clear the cap space needed so they can go maybe after a forward either now or before the season starts, or maybe in season closer to the deadline. For the Ducks, this gives them another good veteran presence on the blue line. They already did sign Klingberg earlier this year to a 1-year, $7 million deal to help with the veteran presence on the team. And their right side looked really good. Their left side a little bit weaker, with Vainikainen and Fowler being good top 4 defensemen. But the third pair on the left side was a little bit weaker, so getting Kulikov definitely helps that role. I do wonder if Kulikov can beat some of their young defensemen. Maybe he'll be sent down to the minors. I do think this is another good veteran signing for the Ducks, who I don't think would make the playoffs, but with all the acquisitions they're making this year, it looks like they're going to try and push for a playoff spot. I definitely do see that. And they had the cap space to do it, because even though Kulikov has a $2.25 million cap hit, the Ducks had lots of cap space to use. So using Minnesota's predicament to get a good veteran defenseman who can probably play on the third line for absolutely nothing was a great piece of work by the Ducks. So this helps both teams. The Ducks get a veteran defenseman who can challenge for a third pair spot, and if he doesn't make the roster, then be an insurance in case there's injuries. As for the Wild, they get $2.25 million in cap space that can help them acquire a forward, which they would probably need either now or before training camp or in the season, probably closer to the deadline. So good move for each team. And lastly here, I have a couple of trade rumors I want to talk about. So first I want to talk about the Vancouver Canucks. Now, as we discussed earlier, Miller, good signing, 7 years, $8 million deal, but that probably gets him off the trade value. Now, I've heard some people say that the Canucks didn't want to modify the no movement clause that he has in his 7-year, $8 million deal to this year because they might want to trade Miller. The extension was just to help facilitate a move and maybe make Miller more palatable to take on. But I just don't see that. You don't sign Miller to a 7-year, $8 million deal if you're going to trade him. I just don't see that. So Miller's going to stay probably for the long haul. So besides that, where do the Canucks go to free up the cap space? Since the Canucks acquired Patrick Allvin to be their GM, they've talked nonstop about trying to free up cap space, and that for a team who's not contending right now, they should not be that close to the cap. But where are these cap moves coming from? They haven't really done anything this year to free up cap space. If anything, they've made it more difficult. They acquired Ilya Mikheyev, who's going to make over $4.5 million this year. They just signed Miller, who's going to make $8 million starting next year. They brought in Kuzmenko, who, if he shows, is a good forward in the NHL. Maybe they try and sign him, and he's going to probably want at least $2 to $3 million starting next year. So where's the moves coming from for the Canucks to try and free up this cap space? Well, I definitely think there's a few. Now, I don't think Bo Horvat will be traded. A lot of people think that now that Miller's signed, maybe Horvat, who's a pending UFA, will be moved to free up their cap space for this year, and I just don't see that. Horvat is a good second-line center. He's worked and grown with the team. He is their team captain right now, and I just don't see a team who's really wanting to get to the playoffs and make an impact in them trade their good second-line center captain. So I don't see Horvat being moved. I know some people may say that Brock Besser could be on the move, but I also don't see that. I think Besser's going to stay with the team. But if you have now Miller, Pettersson, Besser, and Horvat probably being top 6 players, and you brought in Mikheyev and Kuzmenko to be top 6 players, you still have really good bottom 6, but these are filled with guys like Podkolzin and Höglander who have aspirations to be top 6 forwards in the near future. So how do you get those guys playing time? Well, I think you have to move at least one of Garland, Pearson, or Dickinson. Now, Dickinson and Pearson don't make too much. They're around the $3 million range. Pearson just a little bit over. I think Dickinson's a little bit over too. And they don't produce much, so I don't think that those two will be moved because they'd be more of cap dumps. Probably similar to what we saw with the Kulikov deal, I would say, or maybe even a little bit more, to the point where the Canucks give them for nothing, or they give them up with an added asset to take on the contract of Pearson or Dickinson. So I don't think that'll happen, at least not this year. They both still have a couple years left on their deals. I think those two will probably be more next year, off season, or maybe the trade deadline this year when they only have like 1 year left, and it's a little bit easier to take on their cap hits if it's only 1 year as opposed to 2. So I think that the one player that the Canucks should really consider trading is Connor Garland. Now, Garland has 4 years left at $4.95 million cap hit. He's signed for the next few years. He was a great player last year, putting up 19 goals and 52 points in his first season with Vancouver in 77 games. But he was one of the best 5-on-5 players in the NHL. Now, I do think that in a Connor Garland deal, the Canucks could still probably get a second or third round pick and a young defenseman. I think that the Canucks still have a cloudy blue line with Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Tyler Myers, Quinn Hughes, all still being pretty good top 4 defensemen. But Tucker Pullman is the really big question mark, as he looks to be injured possibly to start the year, and he's probably more of a third pair defenseman. They do view him more as a second pair defenseman, but I do think a good young defenseman would really help the Vancouver Canucks. So if a team right now who's looking for forward help were to offer a young defenseman and a second or third round pick for Garland, I think they would do that. Because A, they could probably save some cap space by moving Garland for a younger, cheaper defenseman who could still play top 4 minutes. Probably a defenseman with a cap hit probably between $2 and $3 million, or maybe on an ELC. And secondly, they move someone from a position of strength to a position of weakness because they have a lot of top 9 forwards. Moving Garland could give Podkolzin or Höglander a chance to play on the third line, on top of giving themselves a good young defenseman, which could help their defensive core. Definitely see a Canucks trade for forward still happening, even though it's probably not going to be Miller anymore. But I definitely think that Garland is going to be the one traded. But I definitely want to know what you think. Does Garland get traded? Does Pearson or Dickinson get traded? Maybe Horvat? I don't think that's going to be the case. But I want to know who you think would probably be moved out by the Vancouver Canucks. And maybe which young defenseman could they be looking at to acquire. And lastly here, I want to talk about the Detroit Red Wings. The Red Wings went into this offseason and did a lot of work to improve their roster. They signed a lot of good forwards like David Perron, Dominic Kubalik, and Andrew Kopp. These 3 are going to be good top 9 forwards for the Detroit Red Wings this year. But the Red Wings have a lot of forwards this year. They currently have 15 forwards who are proven NHLers, and if young prospect Jonathan Bergen were to come into the lineup this year, that would make 16. And you usually have 14, maybe 13 forwards on a NHL roster, which means you would need to move 3 of them down. So I honestly don't see the Red Wings moving 2 good value players down. I think Bergen does make the roster this year. I think Veleno, who is also waivers exempt, would probably make the roster this year. I also think that moving a guy down like Oscar Sundqvist, who is probably an overpaid fourth liner, might be a possibility. Maybe they move a couple of fourth line forwards who are not too favorable deals. I think the most likely scenario is that there's a forward that has moved out of Detroit before the season starts. And I think that that forward could possibly be Tyler Bertuzzi. Now, Bertuzzi has proven last year that he is an amazingly gifted top 6 forward for the Red Wings after he put up 30 goals and 62 points in 68 games. Now, he only played 68 games due to the fact that he was probably the only unvaccinated player in the NHL last year, and that really restricted him from playing in Canada last year. But for a player that, if he played all of those games, would have hit at least 70, if not maybe 75 points last year, would have been close to 40 goals, he's a really good scoring forward. Now, I think that the signings of Kulik, Perron, and Kopp might indicate that the Red Wings are preparing to move forward without Bertuzzi in the very near future. I think Bertuzzi is probably looking for an $8 to $9 million deal, and I think that with the Red Wings wanting to extend captain and first line center Dylan Larkin to probably an $8-9 million deal, they probably don't want 2 $8 to $9 million players on their roster, and Bertuzzi is a pending UFA. So I think that moving Bertuzzi to give some space to some of their younger players, like maybe Jonathan Bergen or Joe Veleno, or their new acquisitions like Dominic Kulik or David Perron, giving them top 6 roles, would be good. But I definitely think that a Bertuzzi trade could be coming soon, if not before the season starts, then maybe during the season. I don't see Detroit being a solid playoff team, and I think that if they're probably just fighting for a playoff spot, but not in a playoff spot, they'll probably move Bertuzzi if they're in that predicament at the trade deadline. But I definitely think that Bertuzzi is going to be moved sometime soon, as I don't think the Red Wings are probably going to bring him back past this year. And I definitely think that in a Bertuzzi trade, you're probably looking at a first-round pick and a young player going in return to try and help the Red Wings complete their rebuild and continue to grow as a team and be a playoff contender in the next year or two. So this is all I want to talk about today. Remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I also do a blog to keep up to date with some of the latest news as well. I'll link that in the description below. And I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you soon.